Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for part 5 of my basic series on understanding conjugate style training. And this is going to be very much my own interpretation of why the box squat is utilized in this. Again, some people are going to disagree, and that's okay. This part's purely my opinion. But there's a reason this system of training tends to lend itself very well to box squats, and I'll get into some of that as far as the carryover to deadlifts later, maybe in the next part. But today we need to discuss why the box squat is used. Well, first of all, you can do more training volume with a box squat than you can with a normal back squat because you break up the eccentric concentric chain and you have to hold the stretch reflex at the bottom. You're forced to use a slightly lighter weight. Now that's fine to use maximum weight on a normal back squat when you're doing a certain amount of volume, but when you're trying to maximize total training volume, what you find is that, again, something like a box squat, because of that, allows you to get away with a little bit more total volume, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 more sets every single week, and still recover from it. Now, some people will point out, isn't there more potential like jarring stress on your spine, on your lumbar when you touch the box? It's like, well, if you use a hard box, yes. Like if you're sitting to an actual hard box instead of rubber or foam at the top, that can be the case. But again, if you learn to touch down softly and then sit back, that actually isn't the case so much. And when you start looking at things like shear stress on the knees, this sort of lift, the box squat, actually has less stress on the knee joint than any other form of squat. So there's all of that happening too. So in terms of things just as far as knees go, as far as back goes, as far as total recovery goes, it's just easier to recover from. And if an exercise is easier to recover from and you can get the same amount of muscle fiber recruitment, you're going to get more training in. And more training, more volume equals more results if you can recover from it. So that's a factor. Another big factor I feel like with this is that it helps train you to get your feet out wider, to use a wider stance. The box squat tends to lend itself very, very well to wider stance squatting. Now, that might seem like a minor point till you think about the fact that a system of training like this is used for who? It's used for competitive powerlifters. It's used for various field athletes. Again, the system of training is used by quite a few top-level football players, American football players, people like that. Some fighting sport guys use this. Well, in most of those sports, being able to go out wide with your footing is actually valuable. So it's arguable that a wider stance squat and even sumo deadlifts and things like that are going to give you a better performance on any sort of playing field. So that's something that people need to think about with this too. But when it comes to, say, powerlifting, we could all Olympic squat a certain amount of weight. Every one of us can get strong at an Olympic squat. But if we're talking about moving the most weight possible to parallel, right? Just trying to get to an inch below parallel. If you look at the moment arms and the leverages involved with that wider stance, which is what I'm trying to get better and better at myself, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing assistance movements for that. What you find is that, number one, you start to shorten the range of motion a little bit. Right? You start to shorten the range of motion. In fact, when it comes down to actual depth, a lot of us are going to struggle to hit parallel with that. And that's one reason the box is valuable for training, because you can train yourself to always be an inch below parallel consistently every single training session if you're doing box squats every session. So you can get used to that stance and get used to just hitting that depth because you get tight there. Well, if you get tight there near the terminal end of your range of motion, all right, that's going to give you extra power out of the bottom. Right, that's going to give you extra power because you're bringing other muscles into play as far as abductors and everything that are kind of going to get a deeper stretch. They're going to get a stretch reflex out of that, particularly when you're doing it in a normal competitive fashion. So the box squat lets you train consistently to that depth, but that depth starts to become your terminal range of motion. Meaning when you start taking that real wide stance, getting 4 inches below parallel in astrograph squat really can't be done for most people's hip structure. And that matters because when we're stopping ourselves short, when we're doing normal Olympic squats, it does change how much muscle involvement you get in the bottom. and it can change your ability to generate a stretch reflex out of the bottom. Well, that matters for maxes, and depending upon the person, not everyone is going to be as structurally built to get that sort of stretch out of the bottom with that narrower stance, the shoulder width stance. It's just historically how I personally have squatted most of the time. And I'm reasonably well built for that. But even I'm realizing there are advantages to this wider stance. So it has to do with some of the tension you get at the bottom, the stretch reflex you're capable of getting at the bottom, and the box squat lends itself very, very well to that, and to learn to consistently hit that depth at that stretched point. So that's one factor. Then the other thing you have to look at total range of motion involved. Because you're turning your legs out more, you're actually trimming a very, very small amount of range of motion out. You're getting what a lot of people want out of a low bar, right? You're getting what a lot of people want out of doing low bar squatting by doing that. But notice I'm not even squatting low bar, and a lot of guys don't squat low bar who use this method. They don't. They squat high bar. So you're getting those benefits, though, of low bar that people often think of that slightly reduced range of motion. Well, again, we could come over to the point, well, wouldn't you get less development with less range of motion? In some cases, yes. In the case of this, though, because you're doing more training volumes to make up for it, and you're still moving the joints themselves of all the primary movers through the terminal range of motion, you're just slightly reducing the bar path. But in this case, because the box squat lets you get more training volume in, you're not necessarily going to see a negative from that in training. Because again, it comes down to being forced to use a slightly lighter weight. But not only do we have that change in range of motion, what else do we have? What about bar path? About bar path. When you have a wider stance like that, what happens? The bar is further back, because we're always keeping the bar. When you're perfectly balanced on something like a squat, no matter what's going on with your upper body, even no matter what disjointing or anything that you have happening, we're generally keeping the bar mid-foot. Well, if your feet are turned out wider and you're into that wider stance, that means your knees and your feet are further back relative to your hips. That means the torso stays slightly more upright. If the torso stays slightly more upright, we have slightly better leverages, don't we? So now we're getting into a situation where your terminal range of motion is reduced relative to your total hip joint, even though the hip joint might be moving through the same number of degrees. We have the bar at a better center of gravity, keeping us more upright. And we have more muscles involved. Right, because you get more abductor involved. And because of the way you sit back onto the box, it trains you to use your posterior chain more. It trains you to use more hamstring. It trains you to use more abductor. All of those things when you're squatting. All right, so what this does is that this lends itself to moving more weight. Now, part of it is moving more weight through a reduced range of motion. Part of it is through slightly better levers. The other part of it is training you to recruit more muscles. Well, recruiting more muscles is a good thing. If we're talking about developing maximum strength and maximum muscular development, well, bringing more muscles into a big lift is valuable, isn't it? Of course it is. So the box squat does a lot of things for us. It does a lot of things for us. It's easier to recover from. Easier on your knees. So overall, we can do more training volume to get a higher training response. It helps train you to go wider stance and get a consistent depth while slightly reducing total range of motion of the barbell itself. Can train you to keep your torso more upright, bring more muscles into the equation, and have a little bit better carryover to sports because it trains you to be able to utilize a wider stance. So when you factor all these things in, and then we start looking at factors like total training volume and the ability to train with more total volume and have all this consistency as far as depth, especially on things like speed work, Trains you again to learn to have to be more explosive out of the bottom and utilize more hamstring, more abductor, and all of that at a very stretched position for those muscles to explode with them better from a dead stop. It makes sense why this works very, very well in a system like this where we're doing such a large amount of total training volume every single week. And then it also tends to lend itself better to improving deadlifting. And we'll get over to that maybe next time when we discuss why the sumo deadlift. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.